Welcome back to Nick's Documentaries, where we don't just read history, we resurrect it. Tonight, we're not talking about distant mysteries or lost civilizations separated from us by unfathomable gulfs of time. Tonight, we're talking about something closer, something we can touch, something so perfectly preserved that we can walk its streets, read its graffiti, and understand the heartbeat of a world that ended in a single day. August 24th, 79 AD. Or maybe October. The exact date is still debated, but what isn't debatable is this. On that day, the Roman city of Pompeii died. Not slowly, not through siege or famine or plague, instantly, catastrophically. And in dying, it gave us something extraordinary. A snapshot, a frozen moment, a city locked in time, like an insect in amber. But here's what most documentaries won't tell you. Here's what the textbooks gloss over. Pompeii didn't just die that day. It's been dying and being reborn over and over again for nearly 2,000 years. First buried, then forgotten, then rediscovered, then looted, and studied, then reconstructed. And now, in our age of digital resurrection, reborn again in virtual reality, so complete, so detailed, that you can almost smell the bread baking in the thermopylae. I want you to do something for me before we begin this journey. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine that everything around you, your home, your street, your entire city, will be buried tomorrow, erased from the surface of the earth. And then imagine that 2,000 years from now, archaeologists dig through the debris and find your bedroom exactly as you left it. Your clothes still in the closet, your last meal still on the table. Your final thoughts scrawled on a note by the door. What would they learn about you? What would they understand? And more importantly, what would they get completely wrong? This is the gift and the curse of Pompeii. It tells us everything and nothing. It shows us a Roman city in extraordinary detail, but it's a city frozen at the worst possible moment, in the middle of the worst possible day. It's like trying to understand your entire life from a single photograph taken during a fire alarm. And yet, we try, because Pompeii is the closest we'll ever get to time travel. It's a portal into the ancient world that doesn't rely on imagination or reconstruction or guesswork. It's real. The buildings are real. The objects are real. The bodies, God, the bodies are real. Preserved in their final moments of terror, their final acts of courage or desperation or love. Before we descend into those streets, before we walk through the forum and the brothels and the villas and the bakeries, I need you to understand something crucial. What we're about to explore isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror. Because Pompeii shows us something uncomfortable about ourselves, about our cities, about the illusion of permanence we all live with. Every single person in Pompeii woke up that morning thinking they had a future. They made plans. They worried about trivial things. They argued with their neighbors. They fell in love. They worked. They complained about politics. They were alive in the fullest sense of that word, convinced that tomorrow would come, that next week would come, that next year would come. And then the mountain spoke. If you're drawn to these twilight stories, these moments where history and tragedy and human resilience intersect, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Nick's Documentaries. We're building something here, a community of people who understand that the past isn't dead, that it speaks to us if we listen carefully enough, and that sometimes the most profound truths hide in the ashes of civilizations that thought they were immortal. Turn off the distractions, dim the lights if you can, and follow me into the streets of Pompeii. Not the dead Pompeii you see in photographs, all crumbling walls and empty windows. The living Pompeii, the real Pompeii. The city as it was in those final hours before the sky fell. Because what we're about to witness isn't just archaeology, it's resurrection. Let me tell you something that will change.
Let me tell you something that will change how you think about Pompeii.
The city was doomed long before Vesuvius erupted. Not by fate, not by divine punishment, but by simple, stupid geography. Because Pompeii was built in the worst possible location, and everyone knew it. Mount Vesuvius looms over the Bay of Naples like a sleeping giant, and it had a reputation. The ancient writers knew it was a volcano. Strabo, the Greek geographer, described the summit's appearance and suggested it had once blazed with fire. The local soil was astonishingly fertile, rich with volcanic minerals that made the region's wine famous throughout the empire. The land itself was trying to tell them something. But here's the thing about humans. We're spectacularly good at ignoring warnings when there's money to be made. Pompeii wasn't some remote outpost. It was prime real estate, located on the coast with access to maritime trade routes, close enough to Naples to benefit from the metropolitan economy. The climate was perfect. The land was fertile. Wealthy Romans built summer villas there to escape the heat of Rome. The city's population swelled to somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people. It was prosperous. It was growing. It was alive with the kind of confidence that comes from success. And it sat 7 kilometers from an active volcano. But here's what makes this even more chilling. They'd already had a warning. In 62 AD, 17 years before the final eruption, a massive earthquake struck the region. Buildings collapsed. The city's infrastructure was severely damaged. Temples, homes, public buildings, all devastated. The poet Seneca, who was alive during the earthquake, wrote about it in vivid detail, describing the terror and destruction. Any rational civilization would have abandoned the city after that earthquake, would have said, "You know what? Maybe living next to an angry mountain isn't the smartest idea." But the Romans didn't abandon Pompeii. They rebuilt it. They invested in it. They made it grander than before. When archaeologists excavate Pompeii today, they find construction everywhere. Buildings still under repair from the earthquake 17 years earlier. Scaffolding still in place. Temples being restored. It's like the entire city was one massive construction site, racing against an invisible clock to complete the repairs before what? Did they know? Did some part of their collective consciousness understand that time was running out? The evidence suggests they didn't. Or more precisely, they didn't want to know. Because acknowledging the danger would have meant acknowledging that they'd made a terrible mistake, that their prosperity was built on unstable ground, quite literally. And humans will endure almost anything rather than admit we've been fundamentally wrong about something important. Let me paint you a picture of Pompeii in those final years. It's a city obsessed with status and appearance. Wealthy citizens are locked in constant competition to display their success. They build elaborate villas with stunning frescoes depicting mythological scenes. They install sophisticated plumbing systems, heated floors, private baths. They host extravagant dinner parties where the menu is designed to impress as much as to nourish. The middle class, the shopkeepers and artisans and merchants, they're trying to climb the social ladder. They invest in their businesses. They advertise with painted signs on the street walls. They participate in local politics, which is surprisingly democratic for a Roman city. Electoral graffiti covers the walls. Vote for Marcus, for Adiel. He'll fix the roads. Real politics, petty politics, human politics. And then there are the slaves, the poor, the forgotten ones, who don't leave their names in history, except as footnotes in someone else's household inventory. They're there too, living in cramped quarters, doing the work that keeps the city functioning. Their stories are harder to read, their voices quieter in the archaeological record, but they were there. They were part of this world. All of these people, from the wealthiest villa owner to the poorest slave, they're living in a kind of willful ignorance. The mountain is there. It's always there, visible from almost everywhere in the city, its peak rising above the bay like a warning they've chosen not to read. But the land keeps giving them reasons to stay. The volcanic soil produces incredible crops. The wine is extraordinary. The fish in the bay are abundant. The trade routes bring wealth. Every tangible, immediate benefit keeps them there, while the invisible, catastrophic risk remains just that, invisible. This is the paradox of Pompeii. It's a city that shouldn't exist, but does. A community that built its prosperity on the edge of disaster and convinced itself that disaster would never come. And in this sense, Pompeii is every city, because we all live with risks we don't want to acknowledge. We build on fault lines and floodplains and coastlines threatened by rising seas. We create complex, fragile systems and assume they'll hold. We plan for tomorrow as if tomorrow is guaranteed. Pompeii reminds us that it isn't. Now, imagine yourself there. It's the morning of August 24th, 79 AD, or October 24th, or whatever the actual date was. You wake up in your home. Maybe you're a wealthy merchant. Maybe you're a slave in someone's household. It doesn't matter. Today is just another day. You have no idea it's your last one. The sky is clear. The weather is normal. Vesuvius stands in the distance, the same as it always has. You have things to do, bread to bake, business to conduct, children to raise, arguments to have, a life to live. You walk through the streets, past the forum where people are already gathering, past the temples where morning offerings are being made to the gods who are supposed to protect this city, past the shops opening for business, the thermopolia serving breakfast, the fountains where people gather water and gossip. Everything is normal. Everything is routine. Everything is about to end. But you don't know that yet. And that's the terrible beauty of Pompeii. It captures not just death, but the moment before death. Not just destruction, but the ordinary life that existed right up until the instant destruction arrived. This is what the virtual reconstructions are trying to show us. Not just the architecture and the art, but the life, the moment, the terrible, precious, fleeting moment when everything was normal and nothing would ever be normal again. The technology we have now would seem like magic to the people who first excavated Pompeii. Ground-penetrating radar, 3D laser scanning, photogrammetry, virtual reality reconstruction. We can rebuild the city digitally with a precision that would have been impossible even 20 years ago. And what we're discovering is that Pompeii was so much more vibrant, more colorful, more alive than anyone imagined. Let me take you on a walk through the reconstructed city. Not the gray ruins you see in photographs, but the city as it actually looked, as it actually was. We'll start at the Marine Gate, one of the main entrances to the city. You're approaching from the port, walking up from the bay, where ships from across the Mediterranean dock to trade. The walls of Pompeii rise before you, not the weathered stone you see today, but plastered and painted in bright colors. Reds and yellows and whites. The Romans loved color in a way that our classical imagination, fed on white marble statues and ruins, has forgotten. As you pass through the gate, you're immediately hit by the noise. This is what the virtual reconstructions with audio components are trying to capture, and it's revolutionary, because a silent Pompeii is a dead Pompeii. The real city would have been cacophonous. Merchants hawking their wares, cartwheels on stone streets, conversations in Latin, Greek, Oscan. This is a cosmopolitan place, a trading city where multiple languages mix and overlap. The sound of hammers from construction sites, still everywhere because of the earthquake damage. The splash of water from public fountains, crucial infrastructure in a city without running water to individual homes. And the smell. Gods, the smell. This is something virtual reality can't fully capture yet, though some experimental systems are trying. Ancient cities smelled different from modern ones. Better in some ways. No car exhaust, no industrial pollution. Worse in others, waste disposal was primitive. Dead animals weren't always removed quickly from streets. The tanning industry produced an ungodly stench. But mixed with the unpleasant smells would be others. Bread baking, fish grilling, incense from the temples, wine from the taverns, olive oil from the shops, flowers from gardens and garlands. The complex, layered scent of human civilization packed densely together. You walk toward the Forum, the heart of the city. This is where public life happens, where politics is conducted, justice is administered, business is negotiated. The Forum is surrounded by temples, administrative buildings, markets. It's paved with stone, open to the sky, designed to accommodate large crowds. In the virtual reconstructions, you can see it populated. Hundreds of people going about their day, merchants setting up stalls, politicians giving speeches, priests conducting ceremonies, lawyers arguing cases, and everywhere, statues. The Romans loved statues. Emperors, local heroes, gods, benefactors, all commemorated in bronze and marble. But here's what's fascinating. When you look at the graffiti that's been preserved on the walls, and there's so much graffiti, thousands of inscriptions scratched or painted onto surfaces throughout the city, you realize that the official, monumental version of Pompeii existed alongside a completely different city, an unofficial, vernacular, profoundly human city. The graffiti tells you what the statues don't. It tells you about love affairs and broken hearts, about political rivalries that got personal, about crude jokes and profound loneliness, about gladiators who had fan clubs like modern sports stars, about prostitutes advertising their services with prices and specialties, about ordinary people leaving their marks, their voices, their proof that they existed. One piece of graffiti, found in a bar, reads, "I don't want to sell my husband, not for all the gold in the world. Another, Successus the weaver, loves Iris, a slave girl, but she doesn't care for him. Still, he begs her to take pity on him. His rival wrote this: "These aren't the voices of emperors and generals. These are the voices of people, real people. People whose entire lives, whose loves and heartbreaks and mundane concerns were about to be erased in a matter of hours." Let's walk to the House of the Faun, one of the grandest residences in Pompeii. This isn't just a house, it's a statement. It occupies an entire city block. The famous Alexander mosaic, depicting Alexander the Great in battle against Darius III of Persia, was found here. It's an artwork of extraordinary sophistication, made from over 1 million tiny colored tiles, so detailed that it rivals painting. The virtual reconstructions show you what this house would have looked like when it was lived in. The atrium with its impluvium, a shallow pool designed to collect rainwater. The peristyle garden with its columns and planted beds. The dining rooms with their elaborate frescoes. The private baths. But more importantly, the reconstructions show you how it was used, where the family would have reclined for dinner, where slaves would have worked, where guests would have been received. The house comes alive not just as architecture, but as a stage for human activity. And here's what strikes you when you experience these reconstructions: how familiar it all feels. The basic rhythms of daily life haven't changed as much as we think. People woke up, they ate breakfast, they worked, they socialized, they worried about money and status and what the neighbors thought. They fell in love, they raised children, they grew old, they died. The technology was different, the political system was different, the religious beliefs were different, but the fundamental experience of being human, that was the same. And that's what makes Pompeii so powerful. It's not exotic or alien, it's us. It's what we are when you strip away the veneer of modernity and look at the core. Now let's visit a thermopolium, the ancient equivalent of a fast food restaurant. These are found throughout Pompeii. There are over 80 of them identified so far. They served hot food and drinks to people who didn't have kitchens in their homes or who were traveling through the city. The counters are still there, built into the street front of buildings. Large clay jars, called dolia, are embedded in the counters, designed to keep food warm. The menus were painted on the walls, though most have faded. But from the residue left in the jars, and from the artifacts found in the kitchens behind, we know what they served. Lentil soup, bean stew, fish sauce, the Roman condiment called garum that was ubiquitous in ancient cooking, bread, cheese, wine mixed with water, simple food for ordinary people. But when you see it reconstructed, when you see the proprietor serving a customer, when you see people standing at the counter eating and chatting, it becomes real in a way that photographs of empty ruins can never capture. One thermopolium had a painting of a dog on the wall with the words "Cav Canem," beware of the dog, the same phrase found on a mosaic in the entry of a wealthy home. It's a joke, it's personality. It's someone trying to make their little restaurant distinctive, memorable, maybe a bit playful. That person is dead now, has been dead for almost 2,000 years, but their joke remains, their personality survives, and in the virtual reconstruction, their thermopolium lives again. Let's talk about something most documentaries avoid, the brothel. Pompeii had a purpose-built brothel, the Lupanari, and it's one of the most visited sites in the ruins. Not because of prurient interest, well, not just because of that, but because it's so well preserved and so explicitly documented. The walls are covered with frescoes depicting sexual acts, not as art, but as menu options. a visual catalog of services available. The beds are stone platforms with thin mattresses. The rooms are tiny, barely big enough for 2 people. There are names scratched into the walls, left by prostitutes and clients alike. This was a business, a successful business, judging by its location and construction. And the virtual reconstructions, the tasteful ones that approach the subject academically rather than sensationally, show you what it would have been like. The cramped spaces, the lack of privacy. You could hear everything happening in the next room. The transaction nature of it all. Some of the graffiti is heartbreaking. Names of women who worked there left as traces of their existence. Reviews from clients, crude and boastful, but occasionally something more. A confession of loneliness, a plea for love. Human needs that transcend the transactional. Sex was everywhere in Pompeii. Phalluses carved into streets as good luck symbols and direction markers. Erotic art in private homes. Sexual graffiti ranging from boastful to poetic. The Romans had a completely different relationship with sexuality than modern Western culture. It was public, visible, integrated into daily life in ways that would scandalize contemporary sensibilities. But what the reconstructions show, what the careful archaeological work reveals, is that beneath the explicit imagery was the same range of human experience we have now. Love and lust and loneliness and connection and exploitation and tenderness and cruelty. All of it mixed together in the messy reality of human existence. Walk through the Villa of the Mysteries, just outside the city walls. This is where you find some of Pompeii's most enigmatic art. A frieze covering the walls of a room, showing figures engaged in what appears to be a Dionysian mystery cult initiation. The colors are still vivid, impossible reds and blacks and purples. The figures are life-sized and dynamic. Scholars still debate what these paintings mean, what ritual they're depicting, whether they're religious or theatrical or something else entirely. The virtual reconstructions can show you the room as it was, but they can't tell you what it meant to the people who used it. Some mysteries remain, and maybe that's appropriate, because Pompeii, for all its extraordinary preservation, for all the intimacy of detail it offers, is still ultimately unknowable. We can reconstruct the buildings, we can catalog the objects, we can read the graffiti, but we can't fully enter the minds of the people who lived there. Their inner lives, their private thoughts, their subjective experiences, those are lost. What we can do is approximate. We can use virtual reality to create an immersive experience that brings us closer than any previous generation has gotten to understanding what it felt like to be there. And the technology keeps improving. Each year, the reconstructions become more detailed, more accurate, more convincing. But there's a danger here too, because the more realistic the reconstructions become, the more we might mistake them for truth rather than interpretation. Every color choice, every piece of reconstructed furniture, every detail of daily life we add to the virtual Pompeii is based on evidence, yes, but also on assumptions, educated guesses, and inevitable biases. We're creating a Pompeii that never quite existed, a greatest hits version, a city frozen not just in time, but in our imagination of what that time should have been like. Still, it's worth doing. Because even an imperfect reconstruction brings us closer to these people, makes them more real, reminds us that they were us, living in different circumstances, wearing different clothes, speaking a different language, but fundamentally, recognizably human. Now we come to the question that haunts every visitor to Pompeii, every student of this disaster, every person who's ever looked at the casts of the victims frozen in their final moments. Did they know? No. In those final hours before Vesuvius erupted, did the people of Pompeii have any idea what was about to happen? The answer is complicated and disturbing. The conventional timeline says the eruption began around 1 p.m. on that August day. Or October Day. New evidence from a charcoal inscription suggests October 24th might be more accurate. But whenever it happened, the sequence of events is well understood now, thanks to two extraordinary sources. First, we have the eyewitness account of Pliny the Younger, who watched the eruption from across the bay, and later wrote 2 detailed letters describing what he saw. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, was the commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum, and was also a naturalist, obsessed with observing natural phenomena. When the eruption began, the elder Pliny sailed toward Pompeii, either to rescue friends or to observe the event more closely, or both. He died in the attempt, killed by the toxic gases. Second, we have the physical evidence from the volcanic deposits. Modern volcanology has analyzed these layers in extraordinary detail, allowing scientists to reconstruct the eruption hour by hour, sometimes even minute by minute. What they've discovered is terrifying. The eruption didn't begin suddenly. It built up. For days, possibly weeks beforehand, there were warning signs. Small earthquakes, changes in the water level of wells, animals behaving strangely. These are the signs modern volcanologists watch for, the precursors to eruption. The Romans knew about these signs too. They'd lived through the massive earthquake 17 years earlier. They understood that the earth was unstable here. But here's the thing. Those warning signs are also maddeningly ambiguous. Small earthquakes happen all the time in volcanic regions, without leading to eruptions. Wells fluctuate for all sorts of reasons. Animals are always doing something strange, if you look hard enough. So, when the ground started trembling in the days before the eruption, the people of Pompeii had a choice. They could panic and flee, abandoning their homes and businesses based on warnings that might mean nothing. Or they could stay, reasoning that they'd felt tremors before and nothing catastrophic had happened. Most chose to stay. Because humans are optimists, because we're invested in our lives and our property. Because the immediate costs of fleeing, leaving behind everything we own, disrupting our routines, looking foolish if nothing happens, feel more real than the abstract possibility of catastrophe. This is the same calculation people make today when told to evacuate before hurricanes or floods or fires. Some leave, some stay. The ones who stay aren't stupid. They're just making a different bet about probability and risk. And most of the time, in most situations, staying turns out to be the right choice. But not this time. Let's walk through what happened, hour by hour, using the virtual reconstructions combined with the scientific evidence. 1 p.m. The eruption begins. The top of Vesuvius explodes. This isn't a slow lava flow. It's a Plinian eruption, named after Pliny who first described it. The mountain essentially tears itself apart. A column of superheated gas and pumice shoots into the atmosphere, reaching heights of up to 33 kilometers. That's higher than commercial jets fly. In Pompeii, 7 kilometers away, people hear a tremendous explosion. They see the column rising above the mountain, spreading out at the top like a pine tree. This is how Pliny described it, and it's eerily accurate. The column is visible for miles, a pillar of ash and rock reaching into the sky. What do? Some flee immediately. They grab what they can carry and run. These are the lucky ones, but many stay. They watch. They're frightened, certainly, but they don't yet understand the scale of what's happening. Maybe they think it will pass. Maybe they're waiting to see what others do. Maybe they can't bear to leave their homes, their possessions, their lives. 1:30 p.m., the pumice fall begins. Hot pumice stones begin falling from the sky. Small at first, like gravel, then larger, pieces the size of fists, then bigger. They're hot, not lava hot, but warm enough to burn if you hold them. They're falling constantly, a rain of stone. The virtual reconstructions show you what this would have looked like. The sky darkening as the ash cloud spreads, the streets filling with pumice, people running for cover, using cushions or wooden boards to protect their heads. But some trying to flee the city through the gates, others taking shelter in their homes, in the strongest rooms, away from windows and weak roofs. The pumice accumulates fast. Within an hour, there's a foot of it. Within 2 hours, 3 feet. It's piling up on roofs, and roofs are starting to collapse under the weight. The noise must have been incredible. The constant patter of falling stones, the crash of collapsing buildings, people shouting, screaming, praying. 4 p.m., decision point. By now, several feet of pumice cover the streets. The city is buried up to waist height in places. Moving through it is difficult, but still possible. The fall of pumice continues, relentless. But there's a lull in the worst of it. This is when many people make their final choice: stay or go. Those who decide to leave now, struggling through the pumice toward the gates, toward the countryside, toward the sea. Many of them survive. Not all. Some are overtaken by what comes next. But many make it. Those who stay, who choose to wait it out in their homes, who think the eruption will end soon, who believe they're safer inside than out there in the chaos, most of them don't survive. This is the terrible math of disaster. The difference between life and death often comes down to moments, to choices made with incomplete information, under stress, with no way to know which choice is correct. Nightfall, darkness and terror. The ash cloud has blotted out the sun. It's completely dark now, darker than any night. The only light comes from the lightning that arcs through the eruption column. Electrical storms created and from fires particles colliding and fires. Buildings are burning, set alight by hot pumice or by lamps knocked over in the chaos. The pumice is still falling. It's 6 feet deep now in places, 10 feet. Buildings continue to collapse. The sound of destruction is constant. Inside the buildings that remain standing, people huddle. Families together, slaves with their masters, strangers sheltering in the same space. They're praying to the gods. Some are surely cursing those same gods for abandoning them. They're afraid. They're hoping this will end. It doesn't end. It gets worse. Midnight to 1 a.m. The first pyroclastic surge. This is what kills most of them. A pyroclastic surge is a ground-hugging avalanche of superheated gas and volcanic material. It races down the slopes of the volcano at speeds up to 700 kilometers per hour. The temperature can exceed 300 degrees Celsius. Nothing survives in its path. The first surge doesn't reach Pompeii. It devastates Herculaneum instead, the town on the other side of Vesuvius. But the people in Pompeii don't know that. They can't see anything in the darkness. They might not even realize what's happening in Herculaneum. They just know that the nightmare continues. 6:30 a.m. The pyroclastic surge that kills Pompeii. The mountain's eruption column collapses. It can't sustain its own height anymore, and when it falls, it creates multiple pyroclastic surges that race outward in all directions. The surges that hit Pompeii arrive in the early morning, though it's impossible to tell morning from night in the absolute darkness. They come in waves. They say it's 8 or 10. Each one is a wall of superheated gas and ash, moving faster than anyone can run, hotter than anyone can survive. The people who are still alive, who have sheltered through the night, who have survived the pumice fall and the collapsing buildings and the toxic gases, they die now. Almost all of them, in seconds. The heat is intense enough to kill instantly through thermal shock. People are flash heated, their soft tissues vaporized, their muscles contracting violently. This is why the body casts show people in contorted positions. They died in spasm, their bodies reacting to temperatures no human can withstand. Some die from asphyxiation, as the hot gas sears their lungs. Some are buried by the surge ash content, thick as concrete when it settles. Some are killed by the force of the surge itself, blown against walls or buried under collapsing structures. It's over in minutes. The city that has stood for centuries is dead. Not a single person remains alive within the city walls. The surge passes, the ash settles, and Pompeii is gone, buried under 20 feet of volcanic material. Here's what most people don't understand about the famous body casts of Pompeii. They're not bodies, they're absences. The volcanic ash that buried Pompeii was wet when it fell, like concrete. It hardened quickly, encasing everything it covered. The bodies buried in this ash decayed over time, as all organic matter does, but the ash around them remained solid, creating perfect molds of their forms. In 1863, Giuseppe Fiorelli, the director of excavations, realized this. He developed a technique of carefully excavating around these voids and then pumping plaster into them before removing the surrounding ash. What emerged were casts showing the people of Pompeii in their final moments, preserved in 3 dimensions with heartbreaking detail. You can see the folds of their clothing, the expressions on their faces, the positions they died in. These aren't artistic representations or reconstructions. They're exact replicas of real human beings in the moment of their death. And when you see them, when you stand in front of these casts in the museum or see them rendered in virtual reality, the past becomes unbearably real. There's the cast of a pregnant woman, curled on her side. Experts have examined her skeleton and confirmed she was in her 3rd trimester. She died trying to protect her unborn child, her arms wrapped around her belly. There's a dog, twisted in agony, still chained to a post. It tried to climb higher as the pumice rose, but the chain held it. You can see exactly how it died, struggling against the inevitable. There's a group of 4, 2 adults and 2 children, found in the Garden of the Fugitives. They died together, probably a family. One of the adults is face down, one arm outstretched. The children are curled up. They were trying to escape, running toward the city walls, but they didn't make it. There's a man at the gladiator barracks, his hands still reaching toward the door he was trying to open when the surge hit him. There are lovers, found in various houses throughout the city, died in embrace. Not all of them were married couples. Some were slaves and their partners. Some were adulterous affairs caught in the worst possible moment. But in death, those distinctions don't matter. They're just people who wanted to be together at the end. There's the caste known as the muleteer, a man who died face down, his arms beneath him. For decades, he was thought to be trying to protect something. When modern technology was used to examine the caste, they found gold coins beneath his body. He died protecting his life savings. Each caste tells a story, and each story is a tragedy, but collectively, they tell us something profound about human nature in the face of catastrophe. Some people died trying to save others, parents shielding children. A man found in a house with several disabled individuals, likely a household slave who refused to abandon those who couldn't flee on their own. Some died trying to save possessions, not just money but family heirlooms, religious objects, things that mattered to them more than survival. Some died in prayer, found in the positions of worship, calling out to gods who didn't answer. Some died in defiance. There's graffiti on the walls from during the eruption, people writing messages even as the disaster unfolded. "We're going to die," someone wrote. Not a prayer, not a plea, just a statement of fact. And some died doing utterly ordinary things. A baker was found at his oven. He either didn't believe the danger or thought he could finish his work before fleeing. There are bodies found in bathtubs, in bedrooms, at dining tables. People who chose to spend their final moments in comfort, or who simply refused to believe this was the end until it was too late. The virtual reconstructions now incorporate these moments, not morbidly, but respectfully. They show you where these people died and what they might have been doing in their final moments. It's devastating. It's necessary. Because these aren't historical curiosities. They're people. They're us. Modern forensic analysis of the skeletal remains has revealed incredible details. We know their ages, their health status, their diets. We know who had arthritis and who had good teeth. We know who'd survived injuries earlier in life and who'd lived in relative comfort or grinding poverty. One woman was found with jewelry worth a small fortune. Another died wearing nothing but a thin nightgown, probably woken from sleep by the disaster. A man had evidence of hard labor in his bones, the kind of repetitive stress injuries you get from a lifetime of manual work. Another had teeth filed and decorated with gold, a fashion statement of the wealthy. These details matter. They remind us that Pompeii wasn't a uniform experience. The rich and the poor, the free and the enslaved, the healthy and the sick, they all lived different lives in the same city. And they all died in the same disaster. But here's something that haunts me, something the reconstructions try to capture but can never fully convey. The people who aren't there. Pompeii had a population of at least 10,000, possibly as many as 20,000. We found approximately 1,150 bodies. Where are the rest? Some clearly escaped. They fled before the surge hit. They survived to tell their stories, though those stories have been lost to time. since most left no written record, but others might still be buried, undiscovered. The excavation of Pompeii is far from complete. About 1/3 of the city remains unexcavated, deliberately left buried to protect it from exposure and to preserve it for future generations with better technology. That means there are likely hundreds, maybe thousands of people still there, still in their homes, still in the positions they died in, still waiting after 2,000 years to be found. It's a strange thought that beneath our feet, beneath the ruins we can see, there's another layer of Pompeii, a deeper layer, a layer that contains stories we haven't heard yet, faces we haven't seen, final moments we haven't witnessed. And maybe that's as it should be. Maybe not every story needs to be excavated. Maybe some privacy should be preserved, even in death. Maybe the people still buried in Pompeii are the lucky ones, spared the indignity of being put on display for tourists and scholars and virtual reality developers. But the ones we have found, the ones whose casts stare at us with empty eyes, they serve a purpose. They're witnesses, they're testaments. They're proof that this happened, that this was real, that these were real people who lived real lives until their lives ended in ash and fire and terror. The virtual reality reconstructions that show Pompeii in its final hours, that show the city alive and then show it dying. They're trying to honor these people, to give them back, even briefly, even artificially, the life that was stolen from them. It's impossible, of course. We can't truly resurrect them. We can't undo what happened. We can't save them. But we can remember them. We can study their city, their culture, their final moments. We can try to understand not just how they died, but how they lived. And we can ask ourselves the question they force upon us: what would we do? In those final hours, with the sky falling and the ground shaking and the world ending around us, what choices would we make? Let me tell you about something that doesn't make sense. Something that defies the laws of disaster and survival. Something that the virtual reconstructions struggle to show because it's so improbable that it seems like fiction. Some people survived inside Pompeii. Not many, not even a significant percentage, but more than should have been possible given what we know about the pyroclastic surges, the temperatures, the toxic gases, the sheer violence of the eruption. How do we know they survived? Because of what we find in the ruins. There are tunnels through the volcanic deposits, holes bored from the surface down to buildings that were buried. These tunnels are ancient. They date to within days or weeks of the eruption, when the ash was still soft enough to dig through, but solid enough to hold its shape. Someone dug these tunnels. Someone tunneled down to specific buildings with specific purposes. They were looking for something, or someone. The traditional explanation is looters, opportunistic criminals who descended on the buried city while it was still warm, digging for treasure, prying jewelry off corpses, stealing anything valuable. And yes, looting absolutely happened. We have evidence of it throughout the site. But some of the tunnels don't make sense as looting operations. They go to houses that weren't particularly wealthy. They bypass obvious treasure. They seem to be targeting specific rooms, specific locations, as if the diggers knew exactly where to dig and what they were looking for. Survivors, some archaeologists now believe, people who made it through the eruption, who escaped to the countryside or the shore, who then returned to try to recover something precious, family heirlooms, important documents. Or maybe, hopefully, People they thought might have survived by taking shelter in the strongest rooms of the strongest buildings. Could anyone actually survive what happened in Pompeii? Modern volcanology says no. The temperatures were too high. The toxic gases were too concentrated. The ash too thick. Death was inevitable for anyone caught in the surge. But then we find anomalies. A room deep in the center of a particularly well-built house, where the skeletal remains show the occupants died later, not from the heat or the surge, but from slow suffocation, trapped in an air pocket as their oxygen ran out. They survived the initial disaster. They died slowly, over hours or even days, buried alive in darkness. Is that survival? Technically, yes. For a little while, long enough to understand the full horror of their situation. Long enough to hope for rescue that never came. And this raises the question that the virtual reconstructions, in their commitment to historical accuracy, must grapple with. How do you show the architecture of survival in a disaster where survival was nearly impossible? The strongest buildings in Pompeii were the public structures, the basilica, the temples, the baths. Massive stone construction with thick walls and vaulted ceilings. These buildings didn't collapse under the pumice fall, like the residential structures with their lighter roofs. They stood, but standing didn't mean safe. The pyroclastic surge penetrated everything. It flowed like water, finding every opening, filling every space. The people who sheltered in these buildings died just like everyone else, except possibly a few, a very few, who found the right combination of shelter and luck, who ended up in rooms with thick walls and limited openings, where the heat of the surge was deflected just enough, where the toxic gas was diluted just enough, where the ash didn't completely fill the space. There's a controversial theory, based on the skeletal evidence and the distribution of remains, that a handful of people survived in the Stabian Baths, one of the largest bath complexes in the city. The baths had multiple rooms, thick walls, high ceilings, and a complex layout that might have created protected spaces. The evidence is circumstantial, a lower concentration of ash in certain rooms. Skeletal remains positioned in ways that suggest delayed death, signs of movement after the initial surge, as if people survived long enough to try to escape or help others. But it's impossible to prove, and even if they survived the surge, they still faced an impossible situation. Buried under 20 feet of volcanic material, in complete darkness, with no food or water, no tools to dig themselves out, and no way to signal for help. How long could someone survive in those conditions? Days, maybe. A week, if they had access to water somehow, but not long enough for a rescue that would take months to organize, if it was organized at all. This is the cruelest part of Pompeii's story. The disaster was so complete, so overwhelming, that any survivors were owned anyway. They just died slower. Why should they stop the best? The killer is bad. But here's what the virtual reality reconstructions are starting to explore, and it's fascinating from both a technical and philosophical standpoint. They're modeling the disaster physics, actually simulating how the pyroclastic surges would have flowed through the streets, how the heat would have propagated, where the protected spaces might have been. And they're finding pockets, small areas, mostly in the northwestern part of the city, where the specific combination of terrain, building layout, and surge dynamics might have created survivable conditions. Temporarily survivable, at least. If you were caught in Pompeii when the eruption began, and if you made exactly the right choices at exactly the right moments, you might have survived the initial disaster. You'd need to first recognize immediately that this was catastrophic and that staying in your home was not an option. Most people failed this test, either from optimism bias or simple inability to process the scale of the threat. Second, move to the northwestern part of the city, toward the Vesuvian gate, before the pumice fall became too deep to move through. This required not fleeing toward the more obvious Marine Gate, or the closer gates, which were actually more dangerous because of how the surge would channel through them. Third, find shelter in one of the specific buildings, probably a public bathhouse, or a particularly well-constructed shop that had the right geometry to deflect the worst of the surge. Fourth, position yourself in the deepest interior room, away from any openings, probably covering yourself with wet cloth if you had time to prepare. And fifth, survive the surge itself, the heat, the toxic gas, the ash, and then you'd still be buried alive with no realistic prospect of rescue. The virtual reconstructions can show you this path. They can map it out, highlight the correct choices, simulate what would have happened if you'd made them. It's gamification of tragedy, in a way, but it serves a purpose. It shows just how narrow the margin was between death and temporary survival. It demonstrates that survival wasn't about being strong or smart or lucky in the general sense. It was about making very specific choices based on information that wasn't available at the time. No one in Pompeii understood pyroclastic surge dynamics. No one knew which buildings would provide better protection. No one had a disaster plan for active volcano erupts and buries the entire city. They did their best with the knowledge they had, and their best wasn't enough. This is what makes Pompeii such a powerful historical lesson. It's not a story about failure or inadequacy. It's a story about the limits of human agency in the face of overwhelming natural forces. It's a reminder that sometimes, no matter how smart or prepared or capable you are, you can't win. The mountain is bigger than you. The forces unleashed are beyond your control, and all you can do is make choices in the moment and hope they're the right ones. The virtual reality experiences that put you in Pompeii during the eruption, that force you to make decisions about where to go and what to do, they're not just educational tools. They're exercises in empathy and humility. But they make you understand, viscerally, what it would have felt like to be there. To know something terrible was happening, but not understand the full scale. To have to choose between bad options with incomplete information. To watch the world end around you and realize there's nothing you can do to stop it. And they make you think about modern disasters, about hurricanes and earthquakes and tsunamis, and all the other ways nature reminds us that we're not actually in control of this planet. About the people who die in those disasters, not because they were foolish or unprepared, but because they made rational choices based on incomplete information, or because they simply ran out of time, or because they were protecting others, or because they were unlucky. Pompeii's architecture of survival is also an architecture of death. The same buildings that might have saved a handful of people killed thousands of others. The same thick walls that deflected the surge also trapped people inside. The same interior rooms that provided protection became tombs. There's no moral to this, no lesson about doing the right thing, or trusting your instincts, or preparing properly. Because people did all those things, and they still died. The only lesson, maybe, is this: we are all living in Pompeii. Not literally, not in the sense of impending volcanic doom, but in the sense that we all live with risks we can't fully control, in systems more fragile than we want to believe, one disaster away from having our comfortable world upended. And the question isn't whether we can prevent every disaster or survive every catastrophe. The question is whether we can face that reality honestly, without denial or despair, and still choose to build, to create, to love, to live. The people of Pompeii did that. Right up until the end, they were living, baking bread, conducting business, falling in love, making art, building things. They lived in the shadow of the mountain, and they lived fully anyway. Maybe that's the real architecture of survival. Not the physical structures that fail when tested, but the human capacity to live meaningfully, despite knowing that everything is temporary. Despite knowing that the mountain might wake up tomorrow. Despite knowing that we're all, in the end, just moments away from becoming history. There's a room in the Archaeological Museum in Naples that most visitors rush through. It's not the room with the Alexander mosaic, or the room with the famous frescoes, or the room with the erotic art that draws uncomfortable giggles and furtive photographs. It's the room with the everyday objects. Carbonized bread, still in its round loaf shape, still showing the baker's stamp. A bowl of eggs, preserved perfectly, each egg intact. Medical instruments that look disturbingly modern. Scalpels, forceps, surgical saws. Dice and game boards. Writing tablets with notes about ordinary business transactions. A cradle, toys, a mirror. These objects destroy you in a way the grand artifacts don't, because they're so familiar, so normal. They're the things you have in your house right now, just ancient versions. They're proof that the people of Pompeii weren't historical abstractions. They were people who ate breakfast, and played games, and wrote grocery lists, and worried about their children. The virtual reconstructions are getting better at incorporating these objects, at showing them in context, in use, as part of daily life, rather than museum pieces behind glass. And when you see a reconstructed kitchen with those actual carbonized loaves of bread sitting on the counter, or a reconstructed child's room with those actual toys scattered on the floor, the historical distance collapses. This isn't 79 AD. It's yesterday. It's today. It's a moment so preserved, so captured in amber, that time becomes meaningless. Let me tell you about some specific objects that haunt me. There's a collection of gladiatorial helmets found in the gladiator barracks. These aren't props or decorative pieces. They're real, working helmets, dented and scarred from actual combat. Each helmet is different, customized, worn by a specific person whose name we don't know, but whose profession we understand intimately. Gladiators in Pompeii weren't all slaves or criminals. Some were free men who chose the profession for the fame and money. They were celebrities. Their names appear in graffiti, alongside declarations of love from fans. Cyladus, the Thracian, makes the girls sigh. They had endorsement deals, essentially, appearing in advertisements for products and venues. And they're all dead now. Died not in the arena, not in honorable combat for the entertainment of crowds, but buried in ash, probably trying to escape through doors that jammed shut under the weight of falling pumice. There's a set of medical instruments found in the house of the surgeon. Scalpels, probes, bone drills, forceps, a speculum. The Romans had surprisingly advanced medicine. Not by modern standards, obviously, but far more sophisticated than we generally give them credit for. These instruments were used on real patients. They performed real surgeries, some of which the patients even survived. When you see them in virtual reconstruction, placed on a medical table in a Roman physician's office, with anatomical diagrams on the walls and herb jars on the shelves, you're looking at an operating theater from 2,000 years ago. The physician who owned these instruments is dead, but we found skeletal remains of patients in Pompeii showing evidence of healed surgical wounds. People who this doctor treated, who recovered, who went on living until the mountain ended all of it. There's a bronze strongbox found in the house of Menander. It contained 118 pieces of silver tableware, plates, cups, serving dishes, all carefully wrapped and stored. The family was probably planning to evacuate and wanted to secure their valuables first. Maybe they did evacuate. The box was left behind, but no bodies were found in that particular room, so perhaps the family escaped. But they never came back for their treasure. Either they died later, elsewhere, or they survived but could never return. The city buried too deep, the recovery too dangerous or forbidden. Their silver sat in that box, in darkness, for over 1,700 years before archaeologists found it. There are hundreds of these stories, thousands. Every object in Pompeii has a story attached, a moment of use, a context that was interrupted by catastrophe. And the virtual reconstructions are trying to tell these stories, to show you not just the objects, but the moments. The baker pulling that loaf from the oven, the physician using those scalpels, the family wrapping their silver, the children playing with those toys, the writer making notes on those tablets. But here's the question that the reconstructions can't answer, that haunts every curator and every archaeologist who works with this material. Are we honoring these people or exploiting them? Because let's be honest about what we're doing. We're taking the possessions of the dead, the remnants of their private lives, and putting them on display. We're using their tragedy for education, for entertainment, for tourism revenue. We're building virtual reality experiences that let people experience their deaths, packaged and commodified and sold as content. Is that wrong? Is it disrespectful? Or is it a form of immortality, ensuring that these people and their city are remembered rather than forgotten? I don't have an answer. I suspect there isn't a simple one. But I think about it every time I see a new Pompeii VR experience advertised, every time I read about another archaeological discovery being turned into a museum exhibit, every time I watch tourists posing for selfies in front of the body casts. The people of Pompeii are ghosts now, but they're ghosts that we've refused to let rest. We've summoned them, reconstructed them, put them to work teaching us about Roman civilization and volcanic hazards and the fragility of human existence. Is that what they would want? Probably not. They'd probably want to be alive. Failing that, they'd probably want to be properly buried according to Roman custom, with coins on their eyes and offerings to the gods of the underworld. They'd want their homes to remain private, their possessions to stay with their families, their bodies to decompose in peace. Instead, they're the most famous dead people in the world, more photographed than most living celebrities. Their homes are walkable museums. Their possessions are catalog entries. Their bodies are tourist attractions. And yet, there's something profound about what's being preserved here. Something that transcends the questions of ethics and respect. Because Pompeii gives us something we don't have for any other ancient civilization: completeness. We don't just have the grand narratives of emperors and wars and political movements. We have the small narratives, the personal ones, the everyday reality of ordinary people living ordinary lives. We know what they ate because we have their food. We know how they decorated their homes because we have their frescoes. We know what they worried about because we have their graffiti and their legal documents and their private letters. We know what they valued because we can see what they tried to save when disaster struck. This is unprecedented in archaeology. For every other ancient civilization, we have fragments, pieces, evidence filtered through the lens of what survives and what doesn't, which is usually biased toward the wealthy, the powerful, the male, the public. The private lives of ordinary people are lost. But not in Pompeii. In Pompeii, we have everyone. Rich and poor, free and enslaved, men and women and children, public figures and private citizens, the famous and the anonymous. And that's worth something. That's worth the ethical discomfort. Because these ghosts, these dead people who've become our teachers, they're showing us something we can't learn anywhere else. They're showing us the full spectrum of human experience in the ancient world. They're showing us ourselves, stripped of modern technology, but not of modern emotion, modern worry, modern humanity. The virtual reconstructions, at their best, understand this. They're not just about recreating buildings or simulating disasters. They're about honoring the completeness of the historical record by showing these people as fully human. Not as historical curiosities or tragic victims, but as people with agency and personality and individual stories. There's a reconstruction I saw recently that does something remarkable. It doesn't just show you the city before the eruption or during it. It shows you the same locations across different time periods. You can stand in the Forum and watch it being built, century by century. You can see it in its prime, full of people going about their business. You can watch the earthquake of 62 AD damage it. You can see the reconstruction efforts, and then you can watch it die in the eruption. And then you can jump forward to the excavation, watching modern archaeologists carefully uncovering what was buried. This continuity of time, this sense of the city as a living thing that was born and grew and died and was reborn through archaeology, it changes how you think about preservation and memory and historical obligation. We're not just observers of Pompeii's tragedy, we're participants in its afterlife. Every decision we make about what to excavate, what to preserve, how to present it, how to reconstruct it, these are choices that shape not just how we understand the past, but how the future will understand it. Because in another 1,000 years, if our civilization survives that long, Pompeii will still be here, still teaching, still showing future archaeologists and historians and virtual reality developers what human life was like 2,000 years before their present. And maybe by then, the ethical questions we're struggling with now will seem quaint. Maybe they'll have found ways to honor the dead while learning from them that we haven't imagined yet. Or maybe they'll look back at us the way we look back at the early excavators of Pompeii, who dynamited through buildings and discarded artifacts they didn't think were important, and shake their heads at our primitive methods and incomplete understanding. The Museum of Ghosts keeps growing. New excavations reveal new objects. New technology reveals new details about old objects. New interpretations emerge as our understanding of Roman society deepens, and the ghosts themselves, they remain, frozen in ash, waiting in museums, walking through virtual reconstructions, teaching anyone willing to listen about how they lived and how they died and what mattered to them in those final hours when the mountain woke and the world ended. They're still here. They'll always be here. That's the gift and the curse of Pompeii. Complete preservation, total loss, and the uncomfortable space between honoring the dead and learning from them. Let me tell you something that will keep you up at night. Vesuvius is still active. It hasn't erupted since 1944, but it's not dormant. It's sleeping, and 3 million people live in the shadow of that sleep. The Naples metropolitan area, which includes Pompeii and Herculaneum and a dozen other towns that were destroyed or damaged in 79 AD, is one of the most densely populated regions in Europe. The suburbs have crept up the slopes of the volcano. Apartment buildings and shopping centers and schools sit on ground that was molten rock the last time the mountain woke. This isn't ignorance. Everyone knows Vesuvius is dangerous. The Italian government has emergency evacuation plans. There are monitoring stations all over the volcano, tracking seismic activity, ground deformation, gas emissions. Scientists watch it constantly, and yet people stay. They build, they invest, they raise families. They live their lives in one of the most beautiful and dangerous places on Earth. Why? Because the risk is abstract and a life is concrete. Because it's been 80 years since the last eruption, and that feels like a long time to human brains that evolved to worry about immediate threats, not geological ones. Because the land is fertile and the economy is established, and moving would mean abandoning everything. Because we are, fundamentally, the same as the Romans who rebuilt Pompeii after the earthquake of 62 AD and lived there for another 17 years before the final catastrophe. This is what Pompeii teaches us about tomorrow, not just the historical lessons about Roman life or volcanic eruptions, but the deeper lesson about human psychology and risk assessment and the gap between knowing something intellectually and acting on that knowledge. The virtual reality reconstructions of Pompeii's final hours serve a practical purpose beyond education and entertainment. They're disaster preparedness tools. They show what a Plinian eruption actually looks like, how fast it happens, how little time there is to react, what choices matter and what choices don't. Some of these VR experiences are being used to train emergency responders in Naples. To help them understand what they'd be facing if Vesuvius erupted today, to plan evacuation routes and identify shelter locations and prepare for the scale of disaster that would unfold. Because if Vesuvius erupts again with the same magnitude as 79 AD, millions of people will need to evacuate. In a region where traffic is already notorious, where the roads are narrow and winding, where the population density makes movement difficult even under normal circumstances. The official evacuation plan assumes 72 hours of warning, 3 days from the first clear signs of imminent eruption to the actual event. That might be realistic. Modern monitoring is far more sophisticated than anything the Romans had. We can detect changes in seismic activity, ground deformation, gas emissions, weeks or even months before an eruption. But warnings are only useful if people heed them, and history suggests they won't. Not all of them. not immediately. Because the same psychological factors that kept people in Pompeii will keep people in Naples. The optimism bias that says it won't happen to me. The normalcy bias that resists accepting that everything is about to change. The practical concerns about property and possessions and pets and elderly relatives who can't easily move. And the warnings themselves might be ambiguous because volcanoes don't operate on predictable schedules. The precursor signals might indicate an eruption is coming in days or weeks or months, or they might indicate nothing at all. False alarms happen, and each false alarm makes people less likely to react to the next warning. This is the modern Pompeii dilemma. We have the knowledge to predict disasters. We have the technology to monitor threats. We have the historical precedent to know what happens when we ignore the warnings. And yet, we continue to build vulnerable systems in dangerous places because the benefits feel real and the risks feel theoretical. Until they're not theoretical anymore. The reconstructions of Pompeii aren't just looking backward, they're looking forward. They're asking, what would it look like if this happened today? How would modern infrastructure fail? How would modern communication systems struggle to coordinate millions of people? How would the modern city, with all its complexity and interdependence, cope with catastrophic disruption? Some researchers have created hybrid models, combining archaeological data from 79 AD with modern urban planning to simulate a contemporary eruption. The results are sobering. The pyroclastic surges would behave the same way. Physics doesn't change. They'd race down the slopes at hundreds of kilometers per hour, following the same paths they followed in 79 AD. Except now, those paths are filled with buildings and roads and infrastructure. The death toll would be vastly higher than ancient Pompeii, not because the eruption would be worse, but because there are exponentially more people in harm's way. Even with modern warning systems, even with evacuation plans, even with the benefits of historical knowledge, the casualties would be measured in tens or hundreds of thousands. This isn't speculation. This is what the models show. This is what disaster planners worry about. This is the nightmare scenario that drives the constant monitoring and the evacuation drills and the public education campaigns. And yet, life goes on. Because it has to. Because we can't live in a state of constant fear about low probability, high impact events. Because the mountain has been quiet for 80 years and might stay quiet for another 80 or 8,000. But it won't stay quiet forever. This is the lesson Pompeii insists we learn. Not that disaster is inevitable, though it is, eventually, somewhere, to someone, but that our relationship with risk is fundamentally irrational. We're very good at worrying about things that won't hurt us, and ignoring things that might. We're excellent at normalizing danger when we've lived with it long enough. And we're masters at assuming that our luck will hold, that we're somehow special, that the catastrophe that happened to others won't happen to us. The people of Pompeii weren't stupid. They weren't ignorant. They weren't uniquely unlucky, or poorly prepared by the standards of their time. They were people making reasonable choices based on incomplete information and competing priorities, just like we are. The virtual reconstructions that place you in Pompeii, that force you to make decisions under pressure with limited information, they're not just historical education, they're mirror exercises. They're showing you what you would do, how you would react, what choices you'd make when the sky starts falling and the ground starts shaking and everyone around you is making different assessments of the danger. And most people, when they go through these experiences, when they're honest about what choices they'd probably make, they realize they'd likely be among the ones who stayed too long, who underestimated the danger, who thought they had more time. This is uncomfortable self-knowledge, but it's valuable. Because awareness of our psychological biases is the first step toward overcoming them. Understanding that we're naturally inclined to ignore warnings, to downplay risks, to assume things will work out. That understanding can help us override those instincts when it matters. The modern city of Pompeii, rebuilt on the ruins of the ancient one, has a museum dedicated to the eruption. School children from Naples visit regularly. They see the casts, they learn the history, they watch the simulations. And then they go home to Naples, to houses built on slopes of Vesuvius, and they do their homework and play with their friends and live their lives. This isn't denial, it's adaptation. It's the human capacity to live with existential risk without being paralyzed by it, to acknowledge danger without letting it define every moment. Maybe that's healthy, maybe it's necessary. Maybe you can't function in modern society if you're constantly aware of all the ways everything could go wrong. But maybe, just maybe, we could find a middle ground between paralytic fear and complete complacency. Between obsessing over every risk and ignoring them all. Pompeii offers us that middle ground. It says, remember that this happened. Understand that it could happen again. Prepare as best you can. But also, live, build, create, love. Don't let the shadow of the mountain prevent you from living in its light. Because the people of Pompeii did that. They lived fully, right up until they couldn't anymore. They created beauty and art and commerce and community. They had passions and arguments and dreams. And when the end came, they faced it as humans have always faced disaster. With courage and fear and love and desperation and everything in between. The virtual reconstructions can't change what happened, can't save those people, can't undo the catastrophe, but they can ensure we remember. They can keep the story alive. They can whisper across 2,000 years, this happened. It could happen again. Be aware, be prepared. But don't stop living. That's the gift Vesuvius gives us, wrapped in ash and tragedy, the gift of perspective. The reminder that our time is finite, our cities are temporary, our certainties are illusions. And somehow, impossibly, that's not depressing, it's liberating. Because if nothing is permanent, if disaster can strike at any moment, if the mountain could wake tomorrow, then today matters. This moment matters. The people we love matter. The lives we build matter, not because they'll last forever, but because they're ours, right now, and that's enough. Pompeii died, but in dying, it taught us how to live. We've walked through the streets of Pompeii together, the living streets, vibrant with color and noise, and the messy reality of human existence. And we've watched those streets die, buried in ash, frozen in time, transformed from a city into a monument. But here's the final truth about Pompeii, the one that makes all the ethical questions and archaeological debates and technological reconstructions worthwhile. Pompeii is alive. Not physically, the people are dead. The buildings are ruins. The city that existed on August 24th, 79 AD is gone forever. But in every other way that matters, Pompeii lives. It lives in the millions of people who visit every year. It lives in the archaeologists who continue to excavate its secrets. It lives in the virtual reconstructions that let us walk its streets as they were. It lives in the textbooks and documentaries and scholarly papers. It lives in conversations like this one, where we try to understand what happened and what it means. The Romans believed in a kind of immortality through memory, that as long as your name was spoken, your story told, your deeds remembered, you weren't truly dead. By that measure, the people of Pompeii are among the most immortal humans who ever lived. We know their names, we read their graffiti, we see their faces in the body casts and the portrait frescoes. We use their possessions to understand their lives. We study their deaths to inform our own survival. They wanted to be remembered, probably. Most humans do, but they wanted to be remembered for their lives, for their achievements, for the things they built and created and accomplished. Instead, they're remembered for their deaths, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, for being victims of the most famous volcanic eruption in history. Is that fair? No, but it's something. It's immortality of a sort. And perhaps, if they could see what their city has become, a window into the ancient world, a teacher of millions, a bridge across 2 millennia, perhaps they'd find some comfort in that. Or perhaps they just want their city back, their lives back, their chance to grow old and die peacefully instead of in terror and ash. We can't give them that. We can only give them memory, recognition, understanding, and the promise that we'll learn from what happened to them, that their deaths will inform our choices, that their tragedy will make us wiser. That's a lot to ask of the dead, but it's all we can offer. The virtual reality journey through Pompeii isn't just technology. It's not just education or entertainment. It's an act of resurrection. Imperfect, incomplete, but genuine in its attempt to bring back, even for a moment, something that was lost. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the fact that we try, that we care, that we invest time and resources and creativity into remembering people who died 2,000 years ago. Maybe that's the real triumph over death. Not defeating it, which is impossible, but refusing to let it have the final word. Pompeii speaks to us through the ash, through the centuries, through the reconstructions and the artifacts and the silent streets. It says, we were here, we lived, we loved, we built, we dreamed, and then we died, all of us in a single day. But we left something behind, evidence, memory, a warning, and a gift. Remember us, learn from us. And when you build your own cities, when you make your own choices about risk and safety and where to live and what to value, remember that we thought we had time too. We thought tomorrow would come. We thought we were safe. We were wrong. Don't make our mistake, but don't let fear paralyze you either. Live, build, create, love. Just remember. Remember that the mountain is always there, that disaster is always possible, that time is always limited, and make your choices accordingly. This is what Pompeii teaches us, not through lectures or textbooks, but through the visceral experience of walking its streets, seeing its people, witnessing its end. The virtual reality journey through Pompeii is powerful not because of the technology, impressive as it is, but because of the human connection it creates. When you stand in a reconstructed thermopolium and see the proprietor serving lunch to customers, you're not looking at ancient Romans, you're looking at people. When you watch the eruption unfold and see families trying to protect each other, you're not witnessing history, you're witnessing humanity. And that connection, that recognition of shared experience across the vast gulf of time, that's what makes Pompeii immortal. That's what keeps the city alive despite being dead for 2,000 years. So thank you for taking this journey with me, for walking through the streets of Pompeii, for witnessing its final hours, for trying to understand not just what happened, but what it means. If this resonated with you, if you found yourself thinking about your own city, your own life, your own mortality, and the illusion of permanence we all live with, then please subscribe to Mixed Documentaries, because we're exploring these threshold moments where past and present collapse into each other, where history becomes personal, where the dead speak to the living and the living listen. Where do you live? Is there a volcano nearby, or a fault line, or a coast threatened by rye? I'm not judging, I'm asking, because we're all living in Pompeii in one way or another. We're all building our lives on uncertain ground, betting that tomorrow will come, hoping the mountain stays asleep. And maybe it will. Maybe our luck will hold. Maybe we'll grow old in the cities we love and die peacefully in our beds. Or maybe one day the mountain will wake and we'll face the same choices the people of Pompeii faced. Stay or go. Save possessions or save lives. Hope for the best or prepare for the worst. Pompeii can't tell us which choice is right, but it can remind us that the choice matters, that the decisions we make in those critical moments define not just how we die, but how we're remembered. Sleep well tonight. Dream of ancient streets and vanished cities. And when you wake tomorrow, look at the mountain, whatever mountain shadows your life, and make your peace with it. Because the mountain is always there, and it won't sleep forever. This is Mixed Documentaries. Stay curious, stay humble, and remember, the past is never as distant as we think, and the future is never as certain as we hope. Good night.